It's our community, and I am so pleased to see you because the guests today have a special interest that's also an interest of mine, and of course all that makes it even better. So I'd like for you to meet Dr. Michael McCloud, and Dr. McCloud is he is part of Johnson County Community College, and he is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Chief Education Officer. So I guess you handle all the problems as well as the good stuff.
That is accurate, yes.
That's good. It's good for you. It keeps you on your toes.
It does.
It's very good. And along with him is Dr. Virginia Blanton. And Dr. Blanton is chair of the Department of English at UMKC. And you see, both of them have really good jobs, but that's not the most interesting part of what they do. The most interesting part of what they do is their specialty in history, which is medieval history, and Dr. Blanton specializes in nunneries. And believe me when I tell you, it is not a ho-hum subject. It's really interesting, and here we go. Are you ready?
Oh, yes.
You know, we're talking about the medieval period now, and nunneries were a major part of that age because religion was uppermost, and fear of going to hell or the devil or stepping across the lines that the bishop had set, those were real no-nos. So the monasteries and the nunneries had a very powerful spot in the life of the medievalists of that age.
That's
Would you
absolutely
agree?
right. Yeah,
Good.
absolutely.
Oh,
I
well,
mean,
we're good so far. And I hope that you will find, just as I do, that they are well worth investigating further. I think that we should start by defining the years that we're going to call the medieval era. Can we do that? Okay. Do we agree? Mm-hmm.
There are a number of approaches to the idea of the medieval era and the ancient world and where those things kind of begin and end. For me, so much of my research focuses on medieval England in particular, and so I really work deeply in the years from about 1200 to about 1500, and so that tends to be kind of where I bound things. But there are really important pieces of the medieval world, particularly with regard to religion, that actually exist about 100 years prior to that.
In the 12th century.
Yes, and so there are pieces there that are a little bit different. And Dr. Blanton kind of pulls things from the ancient world forward. So she also hits some things that are part of that Old English era as well.
So we could start in the 12th century with you, Dr. Blanton?
we could.
But you don't want to.
My specialty is actually in the 7th century.
In the
and
7th
what,
century.
Medieval women are doing in the 7th century. I have been involved in a project that looks at nuns from about 800 to the 1600s, roughly, that all across Western Europe. And we see lots of different things happening for women depending upon where and when. But yeah, Mickey's research is much more a later period than mine, and then mine really begins in the 700s.
Well, that's a lot of time to cover.
I know, it is.
I would have to say that kind of wears me out to think about it. You know, many women chose and were chosen to, they didn't all go of their own free will and accord, to dedicate themselves to the church. But there were other reasons that they entered the nunneries other than religious purposes. Could we discuss that just for a little bit? I don't know where you want to start, but yeah. Why don't we start with you, Dr. McCloud?
Well, the interesting piece for me has always been oblation, where families promised children to the church in repentance of, parental sins or in payment.
Or because they had too many kids.
Yes, or to lighten the financial burden of the household. So that's been the place where it's been most interesting for me to look at because of the service aspects that those nuns and priests took on, despite the fact that they did not choose that as a vocation necessarily.
Yeah. But it was a tithe often to the church from a family, and
Yes.
they could have been just babies. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
certainly very early on that was true, that babies could be given. For women in the very early period, in the 700s and even the late 600s, this is all part of the Christian conversion. And so one of the reasons that royal women are becoming nuns is that they're being set up as abbesses over a community that has both monks and nuns in it. So they would be the titular head, usually for a royal community, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And so they would have responsibility for setting up often a mausoleum for the royal family, so it became a funerary place, but it also was a place for maintaining not just the spiritual identity of that kingdom, but also its wealth. And so it was a place to put wealth and goods, which also made them very attractive to invaders.
Well, you know, for a long time I didn't know the difference between an abbess and a prioress, but I do now.
Oh.
And an abbess, you have to poke me in the eye if I say something wrong here, but an abbess is the leader of a larger convent.
Of an abbey, that's
Yeah.
right.
And a prioress, less wealthy, smaller.
That's right. Or if it's a really large abbey, you could have an abbess and a prioress who would be her underling.
But you know, some of these abbesses could have run any big company.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's why they wanted royal women, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries when they're refounding or founding places for women. They wanted royal women who had been married, who had run major households, who could then run this major estate.
Because some of these women, having run major households, did it when their husbands
That's
were
right.
often not there. They were knights or lords of some sort that were soldiers.
Right, so very aristocratic or royal foundations. It was important to have women who had training in running major households.
And they also could take some of their money with them.
That's right.
Yes.
That was
I mean,
also
now
helpful.
follow the money.
That's
Follow the money. So they could keep their money and make the decisions and be who they really were and had the potential to be.
That's right.
So-
Well, and you made the point that women came for various reasons, and sometimes they did it for familial reasons because the family wanted to do this for oblation, but some women did it because it was a way to avoid marriage. Some chose that life because they would also avoid childbirth, which is a huge
Very
infant
dangerous.
mortality rate,
Very
plus they're very
dangerous, yes.
dangerous to give birth. We don't have enough information on that, but we know that that was an option for some women. We also know that later in life, their life stages, after marriage, widows particularly found convents a place to reside. Now, whether or not they became nuns, sometimes that didn't matter. If they gave enough money, as you said, follow the money, they could then be Corradians, as they call them. They could live there for the rest of their lives,
Not
but
a bad
not be
thing.
nun, but have a house within the precincts.
right.
So,
And I think some of them, a few entered because of an abusive husband.
oh, sure.
And, you know, there were a lot of reasons. So that's the other reason that we have to take in the history of these nunneries,
Sure.
because there was so much variety within it. And then we have to get back to the celibacy, the poverty, and the chastity, which we might comment about, yes.
Well, some of that, I mean, when we state those things in history, people always look at those as absolutes. But as Dr. Blanton has already pointed out, so many of these folks came from royal families into those roles as abbesses, and we have to remember the importance and power of the church. In a lot of ways, it was connecting a family both to temporal power and to spiritual power. It was
But that was life. That was the
yes,
life
it was
in those
keeping
days.
multiple spheres of
That's right.
power. And
That's
so
right.
as people were entering some of these places, I mean, we make a lot of it in popular culture, how much the priests would own, you know, large gold rings and large golden pieces that would be personal property. So there's always that place where we look at this idea of poverty as a construct a little bit more than sometimes the reality of the life that they were actually living, because it was a life that could be looked at as a very comfortable life.
Of course. And they would say, moi? live in poverty? I don't think
That's
so.
right. And it depends on the kind of order.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So a Benedictine order traditionally was supposed to have everyone was to give up their goods. Augustinian, less likely so, because it wasn't avowed religious in the same kind of way, that women could go there and maintain their wealth. When it became Clarissan, or the followers of St. Clare, like St. Francis, it was very much a vow of poverty. So
About
it depended upon the kind of order
So you
a
had
woman
to
was
choose
in.
carefully, otherwise
Yes.
you get in the wrong place.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, this is what the bishop, and of course these nuns were consecrated by the bishop.
That's right.
And this is what the bishop had to say. Bishop Spofford of Hereford said, "Due obedience, voluntary poverty, and clean chastity. Clothing formed after religious sadness," and that meant dark colors, you see, "and wideness," so you don't want anything tight. "And long hair, not allowed, a pensive demeanor, with downcast head and eyes unconscious of the passers-by." And that was what the bishop ordained for, or he thought he did, for these nuns. And as you can see, they are dressed very plainly. Those are different orders, I would have to assume. But they all dressed very plainly and very, so nobody would look
Certainly
too much.
modestly, right?
Modestly.
And part of the wimple
Yeah.
and the veil is to both indicate their status as being a bride of Christ, but also to preserve their modesty.
Yes,
People can't see.
Ancillae Domini,
Yes.
yes, the handmaidens of the Lord.
Mhm.
And that was what they were advertising.
Right. So their spiritual reason for being
Yes,
there is absolutely
yes,
that,
yeah.
and that they were to, especially in professions like the Benedictines, to pray every day, to pray the hours. They were going to be in constant prayers so that on behalf of everyone else, so that the rest of us could be living our secular lives.
Well, and the majority of the nuns were at least literate. Yes?
That's a really good question. This project I was telling you about is on nuns and their literacies. I'm very interested actually in women's intellectual culture and the books that nuns were writing, the nuns that who were scribes for books,
And
patrons,
artists.
commissioners of books. They circulated books. This was a 3-year project with 2 of my colleagues, Veronica Amara from the UK and Patricia Stope. She's from Antwerp. And we asked colleagues to come together and really show in various times and places what were the kinds of books that women were engaging with. I think for a long time there was this idea that because Latin was the language of the church, that only monks were literate. And now we're seeing that there was far more literacy, even in Latin, for some of these women.
Yes, but these nunneries were refuges for very intellectual and bright women
That-
often.
Some of
Because
them
they
could
didn't
be.
have a place
Absolutely.
in the secular world.
Absolutely. It's harder to tell. Some countries, I'll give you an example, between Germany, which has a long history of women religious writing books and circulating books. Manuscript survivals for Germany associated with nuns are 20,000 volumes, which is an enormous amount. The
That's a
number
lot
for
of reading.
the number for England is about 200 books. So
that's
because of the decimations after the dissolution of the monasteries, we don't know enough about women's
Yeah.
literary practice in England. That's one of the difficulties.
Well, you got a job ahead of you, Dr. McCloud. There.
There's a lot of research yet
I mean, this
to be
is a
done.
job that keeps on giving.
Yes, it does. It does. It keeps us really busy, but it also keeps that connectivity. I mean, the work that Dr. Blanton's been doing really connects scholars from multiple countries, and so we get a lot of lenses in terms of both the national history that those scholars have grown up in, and then multiple views of different international spaces. It allows for a kind of conversation in the scholarship that we've lost in a lot of places in this country.
You know, the other thing that I think we need to bring up quickly is that often these nunneries were schools for girls.
they
Yes.
And the one that I chose to talk about was Fair Rosamond.
Oh, yeah.
And she was the lady friend of Henry II. And he built for her a bower in the woods. I mean, this was really a really a heated up romance. But she was educated at Carrington Priory in Somerset.
Yeah.
So she was not. She was educated because some of these wealthy girls had a very fine education in the nunnery. So I mentioned that
That's
just in
right.
passing.
That's
That's
right.
a factoid for you.
That's right. And sometimes they had boys in the school too.
Yeah. Oh, yes,
Yeah,
little
yeah,
ones, young
yeah,
ones.
Yes.
I think that this is sort of interesting too. That some of the nunneries were very wealthy, Shaftesbury and Amesbury for two, and I read, and this is really interesting. If the abbot of Glastonbury could have married the abbess of Shaftesbury, their heir would have had more land than the King of England. Now that is.
If it's true.
If it's true.
I mean, it was certainly
Well,
one of the charges laid against these big Benedictine monasteries, Shaftesbury and Glastonbury being two of the big ones that survived the Norman conquest. Glastonbury had the most wealth at the time of the Norman conquest, and Shaftesbury the most wealth for the female houses. Sometimes those charges were trumped up in kinds of ways to really point to the excesses of the church. And certainly, at the dissolution of the monasteries, I checked this because you were interested in Shaftesbury, £1,300 per year, which doesn't sound like a lot in today's money, but it was an enormous amount of money. But most nunneries were very, very modest and had less
Well,
than
and some of them were
£20 a
downright
year.
poor.
Yes, had less than
So-
£20 a year to live on. So Shaftesbury would have been a very important elite royal
well,
monastery.
Blackburn, Yorkshire was one of the poorer ones.
Yes, yes.
We don't want to go there.
Very
No, no, no.
poor, yeah. Nuns, often bishops would do visitations, usually every 3 or 4 years. And in the visitation records, it's notorious for a couple of things. One, the abbess is not handling her administrative duties appropriately. 2, the nuns are not getting enough food and we're destitute and we're poor. We need debt relief. And 3, that the nuns are unchaste. So we go after their poverty. We go after their self-direction. They're not following their spirituality, and they're unchaste. So those 3 cardinal rules that they're supposed to be following are the ones that
Yeah,
we
but some of
see.
the abbesses were bright enough to cry with 2 loaves of bread under their arm. That's
Yes,
right.
at least in the stories.
I
about
have to.
them.
I cannot escape the fact that we must discuss some of some of the. That we're going to pick 3 of the individuals from this general era, but my very favorite is Lady Eglantine.
And the fictional character.
Oh, and yes, she was a fictional character, but oh, so interesting. And if you haven't read about her, read the Nun's Tale, Chaucer, and you will meet her. And she said who in her smiling modest was and coy, her greatest oath was but by Saint Aloy. And she was called Madame Eglantine. Very well she sang the service divine, intoning through her nose becomingly. And she spoke French fairly and fluently after the school of Stratford at Bow. That means her French was terrible. And for French peristyle she didn't know. At table her manners were well taught withal, and never let morsels from her lips fall. Nor dipped her fingers in sauce, but ate with so much care the food upon her plate, that no drop could fall upon her breast. In courtesy she had delight and zest. Her upper lip was always wiped so clean, and that on her cup no speck or spot was seen. Of grease, when she had drunk her draught of wine, graciously she reached for food to dine. Now, where could you find anybody that was more wonderful? Talk about her just a little bit.
Oh, well, she's one of Chaucer's great send-ups because he is critiquing the church at this moment. Her manners are a little overly refined. Given that she doesn't speak French well, she's probably not of the aristocratic class. She's not a noblewoman, but she's trying desperately to
She'd like to
seem
be.
like one.
She would like to be.
Yes. He also says she was not undergrown, which means she's probably a little overweight.
A little chunky,
A little
as my
chunky,
mother used
yes,
to say.
Yes, and given that England has just experienced a famine and the Black Death, We have a woman who in her community is eating very well, fancy sauces, not bread and more modest food, that she's also someone who gives her little sweetmeats to her dogs. Right,
know.
and so while there's
I can
famine and
relate to
people
that.
dying, she's spending her greatest concerns about her dogs and the little mouse that might get caught in a trap. So her sympathies are in the wrong place.
Well, and I think that the basis is the power of the meek and poor who trust in Christ. I mean, this is, boy, she has risen as well.
That's right.
In her, but I mean, she wore a pendant
Yes.
that I think we might spend a little time, Dr. McCloud, talking about.
Yes.
Amor vincit omnia.
Yeah, love conquers all things. I mean,
Yes.
she is in her love of all things aristocratic, and I think it goes to the point that she obviously had risen from another state. She finds herself in love with the idea of love in the medieval romance, and so that idea that her pendant states that love conquers all things. She's an avid reader of the medieval romance and of acts of knighthood and the saving of desperate damsels and those sorts of things. She really has idealized those in the class above her, and so tries very desperately to emulate what she thinks is the truth of that life, because she's not experienced that in her own growing up. You find her trying to be kind of this ideal person. So it's a very interesting comment on the way in which people rose through the ranks culturally and what they believed to be the truth about the aristocracy when they didn't grow up in it.
Well, that's right. But she's just wonderful. And if you haven't read about her, do it. You will just, people say, oh, Chaucer. But you can find, you don't have to read Chaucer in Old English. You can read it in present day English, and the Lady Eglantine is English. She is just well worth your time because she's wonderful. The other one, we have to be a little more staid in our discussion of her, Hildegard of Bingen. Mm-hmm. And Hildegard was a nun. And she was taken into the convent at age 7. Now here's another one she was the youngest of 10 children, I think, and taken in, I forgot what order, was it Benedictine? Yeah, and but she was taken in at age 7, and under the protection of Jutta, who was the prioress of the convent. She was well educated, but here she is, and I thought you might like to see the picture of her, because we decided that perhaps she had migraines, she had, I don't know, but she had visions, she saw lights, she saw stars, but oh, was she bright. Mm-hmm. And could the two of you take a moment to talk about my other favorite, Hildegard of Bingen?
Well, I know a lot of people don't realize when we talk about women in the Middle Ages, for a long time there was holes in the scholarship that left open the idea that women did not have these very strong educations, and yet Hildegard is considered by many to be the mother of kind of natural science in Europe during her time. Her ability to kind of categorize and understand the world and a view of the universe that really today has helped inform the way in which we understood space and our place kind of within that continuum is massive, considering that up until the late 80s, early 90s, we really had this massive hole in medieval studies that did not give a lot of precedent to women's knowledge and what they provided. And she's a huge person in terms of what she left behind for us as points of study within the scientific community.
Well, as she said, my new song must float like a feather on the breath of God. Mm-hmm. I mean, she knew no other life. She was 7 years old when she was taken into the convent. So medicine and medicinal herbs, she was a Renaissance woman.
Absolutely.
Earlier than that.
That's one way to present her. She was not only a mystic, but as part of that mysticism, wrote a theology. We know she wrote her own hymns and psalm, her music. She wrote plays. She was instrumental in framing these mystical visions that she had for others in ways that would that would situate women as appropriate diviners of the both God's cosmos, but of spirituality
Today
together.
we give her a pill.
That's probably true.
Yes. Yes.
But she wrote the Liber Divinorum Operum. Could you talk about that just a little bit, because it was the Book of Divine Works, and in it she discussed.
Well, there's a lot of discussion of the way in which the universe is framed and shaped, and of our place in it and our connection to the idea of God and the divine. You know, in the picture you showed, there's this sense of the tendrils coming from her head, the idea that there's knowledge from the universe, that God is kind of touching her, so that her knowledge could be not only refined, but given respect by others within
Absolutely.
the church.
She couldn't have done that if she had not been in the convent, because nobody would have paid attention. This way, she got a lot of press.
That's right. It's one of the reasons, if you could have the affirmation of the church, it meant that you also then began to have a voice. So we know a lot of really smart women were outside the church, but the church gave them an avenue. You're absolutely right.
Well, and the Book of Divine Works belonged to this medieval genre of combining science, theology, and philosophy in a description of the universe, because that was of interest to bright people in those days, and the internal, which was the human body, and the external, the earth and the heavens, and the idea of a harmonious and ordered pattern. That was, that was a medievalist thought, because they were always looking for a harmonious and ordered pattern of the universe. And that seems to me, I'm not the expert you are, but seems to me typical of the time. Well, sort of.
There was a lot of people looking to understand the shape of the universe and our place, and even in the ancient world, there was a great deal of that going all the way back, to the Greek schools that tried to figure out where we belong. The medieval period really, I think, spent a great deal of time focused on that, because our knowledge was growing so quickly. Our ability to see things differently than we had seen them because of such leaps and bounds. I mean, we think about it now because knowledge doubles and triples weekly in our current state, but at that point, that knowledge, even over 10 or 15 or 20 years, that growth of knowledge was seen as exponential movement for people who really were, for the first time, formally understanding schools and transferring knowledge in a way that we had not done.
Well, and we're almost out of time, but I don't want to leave without talking about quickly, and I'm just going to talk about Julian of Norwich, who was an anchoress. And the anchorites lived on the edges of the church, and they were sealed in for thought and prayer. But in Goddard's view, he said that the anchoresses provided guidance for keeping to the straight and narrow and the running of life's course. And they had 3 windows. One was open to the church, one in contact with her assistant, because you had to have a little help to live in a sealed up place, and 3 allowed people to come and seek wisdom, advice, and prayer. She was the psychologist of the medieval period, and people listened. So please feel free to find out more about Julian and Hildegard and Lady Eglantine and all of these wonderful people. There are many more that we just did not have the time to talk about, but take the time and look. You will be, as I am, fascinated. And as I thank you, Dr. Michael McCloud and Dr. Virginia Blanton, I thank you and say, the sisters, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. However, we have to remember that there were other kinds of sisters as well as those who have become like sweet bells, jangled, out of tune and harsh, if we are to form any true judgment of the medieval nunneries. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your wonderful thoughts on medieval nunneries, and a challenge for all of you to read more. It's our community, and we're delighted to have you.